Stealing firewood was punishable by death, but essential to survive. The winter of 1347 fell hard across England. The winds blew sharp through the thatched roofs of peasant cottages, and frost bit deep into the bones of the poor. Fire, once a symbol of hearth and warmth, became the only barrier between life and death. But fire needed fuel, and for the common folk, that meant one thing: wood. Yet the forests that stretched across the English countryside were not theirs to touch. Every tree, branch, and fallen twig belonged to the Lord. The woods were not a sanctuary. They were a trap. Under the harsh forest laws still enforced since Norman rule, it was a crime to take firewood without permission. Even dead branches lying on the ground were considered the property of the manor. And the punishment? Hanging. No fines, no warnings. If you were caught taking wood, especially in winter, you could be strung from the gallows before your children's eyes. And yet, they did it anyway, because they had no choice. When the hearths went cold and the wind pushed through every crack in the walls, families would send their children into the woods under cover of night. Small hands gathered sticks from the forest floor. Mothers wrapped twine bundles in old cloth. Fathers stood watch, ears straining for the sound of the bailiff's patrol. Sometimes they succeeded. Other times, they were caught. In one recorded case from Yorkshire in 1347, a man named Thomas Alwyn was found with a bundle of twigs hidden beneath his cloak. He pleaded with the reeve, said it was only enough to warm soup for his sick daughter. But the law didn't bend for sickness. He was dragged to the manor court, sentenced by the steward, and hanged at dawn. His daughter died 3 days later, but Thomas was just one of many. The records show others. Agnes Broden, caught with a basket of bark. John Le Smith, hung for felling a single sapling. A boy of 9, unnamed, beaten so badly for carrying kindling that he never walked again. These weren't criminals, they were survivors. Peasants lived by necessity, not rebellion. Firewood wasn't luxury, it was life. Without it, bread dough wouldn't rise, water wouldn't boil. Frostbite crept into fingers at night, and illness spread like smoke. Still, the law remained firm. The lords feared precedent more than pity. If one family took wood, others would follow. If the forest was stripped bare, the manor lost control, and so, mercy was dangerous. Compassion was discouraged. The gallows stood tall at the edge of the woods, not just as punishment, but as a warning. And yet, in every village, fires still burned. The peasants had learned to adapt. They gathered moss and dry leaves. They dug into dung heaps to burn dried animal waste. Some fashioned secret stoves from clay and rock, hidden beneath floors, and always, there were night runs into the forest. They called it the Black Harvest. It was done in silence. No metal tools, no lanterns. Children trained to walk barefoot so their steps wouldn't snap twigs. Mothers sang lullabies not to soothe, but to signal when to run. The forest became a second home, a place of danger and defiance, lit not by moonlight, but desperation. And still the gallows took more. But what makes this chapter of history so haunting is not just the cruelty, it's the logic behind it. Because to the lords, firewood wasn't just about heat, it was control. Owning the trees meant owning the peasants' nights, deciding who stayed warm and who shivered, who fed their children and who buried them. A stick of wood was more than fuel, it was permission to live. And yet, for all their power, the lords never stopped the stealing. They couldn't. Because when the cold comes, laws become background noise. Hunger trumps fear, and fire, small, crackling, defiant, becomes revolution in its simplest form. Today, no one is hanged for kindling, but the echoes of that time still smolder in forgotten footnotes. Tourists walk through manor ruins and forest paths, unaware that centuries ago, those same woods were patrolled not just by hunters, but by the hunted. The peasants who crept into the trees at night weren't just criminals, they were the fire keepers of the forgotten. And every flame they lit in silence, every ember stolen from tyranny, was a small act of rebellion against a world that chose law over life. We don't know most of their names. They weren't recorded in history books, but their stories remain, hidden in parish records, scribbled in margins, whispered in folk tales. And maybe that's enough. Maybe every time we light a fire without fear, we carry their legacy with us, the legacy of those who risked everything, not for wealth or glory or revenge, but simply to stay warm. Boiling leather shoes into soup was a crime of desperation. The wind that blew through 14th century France during the Great Famine did not just chill the bones, it hollowed out entire communities. From 1315 to 1317, rain fell like a curse. Fields drowned, crops rotted. The roads turned to rivers of mud, and the sun, that ancient promise of harvest and hope, remained hidden behind an endless gray veil. What began as a poor season turned into a nightmare of starvation, desperation, and slow, gnawing death. It was in this nightmare that some families did the unthinkable. They boiled their shoes for soup, not metaphor, not exaggeration. Leather shoes, belts, harness straps, anything made of hide was thrown into pots, softened by boiling, and consumed as broth. It wasn't food, it wasn't nourishment, but it was something to put into a belly that had been empty for days. A desperate act committed not out of madness, but out of the purest and most primal instinct, the will to survive. The Great Famine was not like other famines. It didn't strike with a single blow. It dragged itself across Europe like a long funeral march. Beginning in the spring of 1315, the rain came and refused to stop. Planting seasons were ruined. Wheat failed. Oats vanished. Salted meat spoiled in flooded storage pits. And with each passing month, the panic deepened. Prices soared. One chronicler wrote that the cost of bread rose sixfold, forcing families to sell livestock, then tools, then land, then themselves. People ate what they could. Dogs, cats, rats, grass, bark, clay, moss scraped from stones, and yes, leather. It was known across France that tanned leather, treated with lime, dungus, and other toxic agents, was never meant to be eaten. Consuming it could cause violent illness, intestinal bleeding, even death. But famine does not respect warnings. When your child is crying from hunger and the only thing left in your home is a belt that once held up your trousers, you cut it into strips and throw it in a pot. Boiling didn't make it safe. It made it soft. And if you added some stale cabbage water, a pinch of salt, or herbs pulled from roadside ditches, you could at least pretend it was soup. In the villages of Normandy, in the outskirts of Paris, even in rural Picardy, there are recorded incidents of peasants boiling down their shoes and belts just to feel something pass their lips. Often it did more harm than good, but it delayed death. And for many, that was enough. But this act, this desperate choice, was not just dangerous. It was illegal. In many parts of France during the famine, local magistrates and church officials declared the consumption of tanned goods a crime. Edicts were issued banning the boiling of leather on grounds of public health and spiritual transgression. Leather was not sacred, but it was symbolic, meant for clothing, labor, travel. To eat it was seen as a collapse of order, a sign that society had failed so completely that the roles of objects themselves had been reversed. It was madness manifesting in the kitchen. And perhaps most cruelly, those who enforced these bans were not starving. The nobility and the church hoarded what food remained, buying up grain with gold, while entire villages starved to death within sight of storehouses. When peasants were caught boiling shoes or belts, they were often punished, not with mercy, but with public shame, fines, even imprisonment. Some were paraded through town with pieces of leather tied around their necks. Others were branded as unclean, forbidden from entering markets or churches. Imagine the humiliation of being punished for trying to survive. One account, recorded by a French monk in 1316, tells of a mother in Alms who was caught boiling her husband's old leather boots to feed her children. The boots had belonged to him before he died of starvation just weeks earlier. She was brought before a tribunal, weeping, holding a child so thin he could not cry. The ruling? She was fined and exiled from the village. The child died on the road. The cruelty of the famine was not just in the hunger. It was in how the hunger revealed the rot within the system. Landowners refused to lower rents. The church continued to collect tithes. Nobles still demanded labor and taxes, even as their peasants collapsed in fields. Charity came in sermons, not bread. And when the starving reached for the last things they owned, leather belts, broken shoes, old satchels, they were told they had crossed a line. But history remembers what law tried to erase: the boiled belts, the shoes in the pot, the scraps of tanned hide shared among children who no longer knew the taste of meat or grain. These were not sins. These were survival stories. When the famine finally began to lift in 1317, it did not end cleanly. The soil was poisoned with grief. Fields lay fallow not from flood, but because there was no one left to till them. In some villages, entire family lines vanished. Birth rates collapsed. Ghost towns dotted the countryside, and the fear lingered. Not just of hunger, but of the memories it left behind. Of the nights spent chewing boiled leather, gagging down the taste of desperation. Today we read these stories with a mix of horror and disbelief. How could things ever get so bad that a person would eat their own shoe? But this question misses the truth. The people who boiled their shoes weren't primitive or foolish. They were just human. And they were trying to stay that way in a world that had forgotten them. Boiled leather soup was not a meal. It was a last stand. And it's worth remembering, not just as a strange historical footnote, but as a mirror, because famine, injustice, and desperation are never far from the surface. And the next time we see someone doing something we don't understand, something that seems beneath dignity, perhaps we should ask, what hunger drove them there? What silence surrounded their suffering? And how long had they been boiling shoes before anyone bothered to notice? Because for 2 years in France, the smell of leather was not the scent of saddles or belts. It was dinner. Hunting deer in the Lord's forest meant execution if caught. In the winter of 1386, 3 men stood beneath the shadow of a hanging tree in a cold corner of Wales, their hands bound, their heads bowed. Their crime? Killing a deer. Not a man, not a noble, a deer. And for that, execution. Because in medieval Britain, the forest was not free. It belonged to the crown or to the lord who held it. And everything within it, every stag, boar, rabbit, and tree, was his property. Sacred. Protected. Reserved for royal sport, not survival. Poaching was not just theft. It was rebellion. It was defiance of a system that defined life by bloodline and ownership. And so, it became a capital offense. The forests had their own laws, their own officers, wardens, foresters, and gamekeepers, patrolling woods like sacred temples, tracking footprints, counting arrows, measuring antlers left behind. If you killed a deer in the Lord's forest, if you even possessed venison without explanation, you could be flogged, imprisoned, mutilated, or hanged. And in 1386, that law was enforced, mercilessly. The names of the 3 Welshmen are lost to time, but their story was preserved in fragments, parish records, court scribes, and regional tales. That winter was brutal. The harvest had failed. Snow came early. Firewood was scarce. Children coughed in the corners of stone huts with nothing but stale bread and melted snow to keep them alive. So the men, fathers, went into the woods, not to sell, not to defy, but to survive. They tracked the deer for hours in silence, careful not to leave signs. They struck it cleanly, dressed the carcass near the stream, and carried it back beneath nightfall, wrapped in thick cloth, praying no one would see. But someone always does. It's unclear who reported them. Maybe a rival. Maybe a hungry neighbor hoping to win favor. Maybe one of the Lord's rangers watching from the dark. They were arrested 3 days later. The meat had already been cooked, eaten, shared among their starving families. By then, it was gone, but the bones remained. That was enough. They were brought before the local magistrate, where the Lord's authority weighed heavier than reason. They confessed, not out of guilt, but out of honesty. They said they did it for their children. The youngest was 5. She had not eaten a full meal in a week. But the law did not bend. Because if it did, if every peasant were allowed to take from the forest when hungry, then the Lord's sport, his power, his divine right would be meaningless. So the men were sentenced to hang. They were led to the gallows at dawn. Villagers gathered, not to celebrate, but to mourn, to watch, to remember. Because the message wasn't just punishment, it was warning. The deer was worth more than the men who killed it. And in the eyes of the system, survival was not an excuse. Afterward, the children were taken in by extended family. One died of sickness before spring. The others lived, but never forgot. For generations, their descendants carried the story, not as legend, but as wound, and the forest remained. Tall, silent, full of life no one else was allowed to touch. The king's deer roamed freely, while the people watched from the edge of hunger, and even now, the ghosts of that injustice echo. We speak of medieval laws like relics, distant, primitive, but they were precise, intentional, and cruelly efficient, designed to protect power under the mask of order, to criminalize need, to turn nature into property, and those who reached for it into criminals. So, when you walk beneath the trees in Wales, when you see deer grazing beyond the fence, remember that once, reaching for that life meant giving up your own. And 3 men did, not for profit, not for pride, but because their children were starving. And in a world that punished love as treason, their deaths were not justice. They were sacrifice. Breaking Sabbath to cut firewood was seen as a sinful act. In the hushed stillness of medieval Europe, Sunday was no ordinary day. It was sacred. It belonged not to kings, not to peasants, but to God alone. From the grand cathedrals that loomed over cities to the tiny chapels nestled between forested hamlets, the message was the same: thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. To defy that commandment was not merely to break a rule, it was to risk one's very soul. And yet, in the shadowed corners of that world, a quiet rebellion burned, lit not by firebrands, but by those too cold, too hungry, or too desperate to obey. The year might have been 1350 or 1432 or 1491. It hardly mattered. The scene repeated itself across the centuries. Somewhere in a frostbitten village, a man awoke early on a Sunday morning. His children were shivering under rough wool blankets. The hearth had gone cold in the night, and no firewood remained. The axe stood outside, heavy with frost. The forest waited in silence, but so too did the law and the church. Cutting firewood on a Sunday was considered a violation of divine order. The Sabbath was for rest, for reflection, for prayer, not for toil. Canon law forbade labor on holy days, and local parish priests were often quick to remind their flocks that work on the Lord's day invites the devil into your home. And yet, when survival whispers louder than Scripture, even the most faithful are faced with impossible choices. Some did it in secret, rising before the bells rang for Mass, hoping the sound of wood splitting would be lost in the early morning mist. Others worked with trembling hands, half expecting lightning to strike with every swing of the axe. They weren't defiant. They were afraid, but not of sin, of freezing, of hunger, of letting their families suffer for a rule they could not afford to keep. It wasn't just firewood. Shoemakers were known to quietly mend torn boots under candlelight. Women might churn butter or patch garments in silence while their neighbors walked to church. Even midwives, when summoned on a Sunday, would whisper prayers of apology as they rushed out the door, fearing not only the judgment of God, but of their fellow villagers, because Sabbath breakers could be reported, fined, or shamed. In many towns, public punishments awaited those who were caught. A man found chopping wood might be brought before the local magistrate, where his name would be read aloud during Mass, branded a sinner for all to hear. In more severe cases, he could be fined more than he earned in a month, or sentenced to spend hours in the pillory while townspeople spat and hurled insults. But even worse was the spiritual fear. The church taught that laboring on the Sabbath was a mortal sin, eternal damnation, not just social shame, but a one-way path to hell. Monks wrote sermons warning that those who struck iron or carved wood on Sundays would find their hands blistered in the afterlife. For each cut you made, one preacher wrote, a demon shall cut you back. And yet, despite the fear, people worked, because fear of hell could not compete with the cold, because eternity felt far away. But the hunger of a child was immediate, because while priests had roofs and candles and warm meals, the poor had only what they made for themselves, even if making it cost them their salvation. Over time, this quiet resistance became almost ritualistic. Some households developed coded ways to work around the law, leaving boots half repaired on Saturday night, so only finishing touches were made Sunday. Others would claim they were walking with the Lord into the woods and come back carrying logs. A dangerous game, but one many were forced to play. These moments rarely made it into official records. The chroniclers of the time focused on kings, wars, and plagues, not on a farmer who dared to split a log on Sunday, but in rare village court rolls and clerical complaints, traces of these stories survive. Names of men and women fined for Sabbath labor, for handling leather on the Lord's Day, for cutting bread by unpaid hand. Each fine, each accusation is a glimpse into a life lived on the edge of survival and damnation. Even reformers and scholars began to question the harshness. In later centuries, some clerics noted the cruelty of laws that punished labor but ignored suffering. What mercy is there, one priest asked, in watching a widow freeze rather than let her son gather wood? But for centuries, mercy was a rare visitor to the courts of religious law. And so, the world spun on, with its frozen mornings and its silent fires, with men and women weighing eternal judgment against the needs of a single night. They were not rebels. They were not heretics. They were simply human, torn between faith and flesh, between the chill of poverty and the heat of divine punishment. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the breaking of the Sabbath, but that for so many, survival was an act that had to be hidden, repented, and feared. Because in those forgotten villages, the Sabbath was not a day of rest. It was a day of quiet, desperate defiance. Women secretly sold church candles for bread. It was winter, but not just any winter. The year was 1321, and famine gripped the north of England with icy fingers. Crops had failed 2 years in a row. Grain stores ran dry. Animals died in their stalls. Children cried themselves to sleep with hollow bellies. And in the city of York, a woman made a decision that would define the rest of her short life. She stole a candle, not from a market stall, not from a tavern, from a church. It was made of beeswax, precious, heavy, and expensive. In the medieval world, beeswax was far more than light. It was sacred. Church candles burned not just to illuminate altars, but to carry prayers toward heaven. Taking one was not just theft, it was desecration. But the woman who took it didn't do it out of blasphemy. She did it because she hadn't eaten in 2 days. Records from York that year describe mass hunger, and especially among the poor. Oats, barley, and dried beans were hoarded by those who had them. Prices rose beyond what any servant or widow could afford. The cold was cruel. Fires were rare, and death crept into doorways like a shadow no one could shut out. So, she took the candle, and in a dark alley in the back streets of the shambles, she sold it for oats. A single bag. Enough to feed herself and her children for 3 days, maybe. She might have gone unnoticed, but someone saw. A shopkeeper, a boy, a rival. We don't know who reported her, but within a day she was dragged before the civic wardens. The charge, sacrilege, theft from the house of God, and punishment came swiftly. She was flogged in public, whipped through the streets of York with her arms bound, her back exposed to the cold wind, her wounds opened before the faces of the very people who once sat beside her in church pews. It was meant to be a warning, not just to her, but to every other starving woman watching from the alleys, hiding behind doors with stomachs twisted in hunger. The message was clear. Hunger is not an excuse. Desperation is not innocence. The sanctity of the church outweighed the sanctity of your survival, and yet, she was not alone. Throughout medieval Europe, especially during famine winters, women in cities and market towns quietly did the same. Church candles disappeared. The stubs of beeswax melted down, sold in exchange for turnips, dried peas, scraps of salted meat. It was a black market economy of survival, because for the poor, God lived in stone towers, but hunger lived in their bones. Some women were caught and punished, others vanished into history. But the phenomenon was real, widespread, and largely erased by official records. Because it wasn't just a crime, it was a scandal. To admit that starving women were stealing from churches was to admit that the system had failed, that divine charity had limits, that piety did not put food on the table, and the church could not allow that truth to spread. So they silenced it, with lashes, with shame, with quiet burials. But history still whispers. In the archives of York, in one brittle entry from 1321, it is written plainly. One woman, having taken the wax of the altar, was punished with flogging. Her offense, to trade it for oats. No name, no trial transcript, no record of what became of her afterward. But the image remains. A mother kneeling in the cold, weeping not from the pain of punishment, but from the fear that her children would starve anyway. And who can say she was wrong? When the line between faith and survival thins to a strand, what would any of us do? We elevate saints and martyrs who died for belief. But what about the women who lived for their children, even when the cost was their soul? We don't write hymns for them. We don't light candles in their name, because those candles were already sold. And so, they disappear. But their story does not deserve silence, because in every dark alley of history, there are women who chose survival over sanctity, who stole light to feed the hungry, who defied divine judgment to serve a deeper truth, that no god should demand a mother let her child starve with a church full of wax behind her. In the frozen streets of York, 1321, that truth burned quietly for the price of one candle. Lighting fires in forbidden areas could get you beaten or banished. In the frozen silence of a medieval winter, stone becomes cruel. The walls of great castles and manors, so impressive from the outside, turn to tombs for the ones who live below. And in those dark, breathless corners, where heat cannot reach and the wind slides in through the cracks, servants made a terrible choice: obey and freeze, or light a fire and risk the lash. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, many castles across England and France enforced strict fire codes. Fires were only allowed in designated hearths, typically within the Great Hall, the kitchen, or select chambers of the nobility. Anywhere else, it was forbidden. Not because the lords were sadistic, but because fire was feared. Too many wooden beams, too much thatch. A single stray spark could consume an entire castle wing. And so, the rules were absolute: no flame below ground, no warmth in the cellars, no embers in the servant quarters. But for those who slept in the basements, among barrels of salt meat, damp floors, and rats, the cold was not just discomfort, it was pain. Servants wrapped themselves in old sacks, slept in piles like animals, held each other in silence just to feel skin. But in the heart of winter, even that wasn't enough. And so, they broke the rules. A handful of coals smuggled in a pot, a hidden brazier behind the barrels, a whisper through the servants' stairwell: "Tonight we burn." They weren't trying to rebel. They weren't careless. They were trying not to die. But when they were caught, the punishment was brutal. One 1312 account from a manor near Lincoln tells of a maid named Elise who was discovered with a fire hidden in a wine barrel. She had used it to warm her baby, born in secret during the dead of winter. The steward found the smoke curling beneath the trapdoor and dragged her out by her hair. She was whipped until her back bled. Her child was taken from her arms. She was banished the next morning, barefoot in the snow. In another account from a Scottish border castle, a stable hand lit a fire beneath the stairs to dry his frozen boots. The smoke was faint, but a guard smelled it and sounded the alarm. The fire was stamped out before it spread, but the stable hand was taken to the courtyard and beaten with a rod until his teeth broke. The punishment was not for the fire, it was for the disobedience. The lords feared the servants more than they feared the cold. A single act of defiance, even one born from desperation, threatened the fragile hierarchy. If one man warmed his hands without permission, others would follow. If the basement became a haven, it would stop being controllable, and so they ruled with terror. Fires were allowed only where visibility was total, where guards could see, where smoke could be tracked, where the flames burned for beauty, not survival. And yet, the secret fires continued, because cold doesn't ask permission. In one hidden corner of Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered layers of charcoal beneath the old storerooms, tiny soot stains on stone that once lined a hidden servant passage. No hearth, no chimney, just the proof of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of secret burns. Each one a risk, each one a plea. Some servants were caught, many weren't, but they all knew the cost: beatings, banishment, imprisonment, and still, they chose flame. Because a bruised back was better than frozen lungs. Because a scar meant you were still alive. We walk through these castles now, restored, bright, safe. Tour guides speak of grand halls, roaring fireplaces, glowing feasts, but few mention the servants who huddled beneath those very stones, hands outstretched to a flame no one was allowed to see. And that's why this matters, because history remembers the fire of kings, but not the fire of the cold, the quiet, hidden embers lit by hands that had no right to warmth. The rulebooks may have called it disobedience, but it was survival. It was defiance whispered in ash. And it was brave. Because those servants weren't trying to change the world. They weren't trying to make a statement. They just wanted to feel their fingers, to sleep without shaking, to wake up one more day. And in that darkness, surrounded by silence and stone, They lit their forbidden fires and lived. Peasants lied to monks to get more bread at the Almonry. In the flickering cold of a medieval winter, the line at the monastery's Almonry stretched like a shadow down the lane. Cloaked figures huddled against the wind, their faces hollowed by frost and famine. This was the only place left in town where the poor could come not to beg, but to plead. For bread, for broth, for a few meager scraps to see them through the coldest nights. And while the monks inside prayed for the souls of kings, outside, peasants lied for the lives of their children. This was not sin. This was survival. In the High Middle Ages, monasteries were not just centers of prayer. They were lifelines. Across England, France, and the rest of Christendom, monasteries maintained almonries, designated spaces often near the gates where the poor could come and receive alms, food, clothing, sometimes coins. It was part of a monk's sacred duty to perform acts of charity. Christ had fed the hungry, and so they too must feed those who came knocking. But winter changed everything. When the harvest failed, or when war had stripped the fields and men were buried under frostbitten soil, the monastery gates became crowded with the desperate. The line grew longer, the bread grew thinner, the rules became stricter, and the monks, overwhelmed, began to ration what they had. 1 loaf per family, 1 ladle per head, no more. That's when the lies began. It started simply. A woman would say she had 7 children when she had 3. A man would limp to the gate claiming his wife was deathly ill, though she had passed months before. Some came with babies that weren't theirs. Others borrowed children from neighbors for the day. There are even records, quiet, discreet, rarely publicized, of townsfolk stuffing straw into cloaks to feign the shape of starving infants hidden beneath. They weren't trying to cheat the system. The system had already failed them. To understand this, we must understand the brutality of medieval poverty. There was no welfare, no state relief, no food banks. If the local lord was cruel or absent or dead in battle, then the monastery was your last hope. And even then, almsgiving was governed by rules of worthiness. Some monasteries required that you confess your sins before receiving bread. Others denied alms to known drunkards, idle men, or women of suspicious reputation. A poor man who dared show up twice in one day was accused of gluttony. A woman with no husband was judged for her chastity. So, the poor learned to adapt. They crafted stories, not because they were liars, but because truth no longer kept them alive. They said what they had to say. They learned which monks were softer, which ones asked fewer questions. They learned to weep when needed, to invoke God with trembling lips, to carry borrowed children in borrowed arms. It was a quiet war fought in whispers, between the moral ideals of charity and the terrible mathematics of need. One monk, writing in the winter of 1298, recorded his dismay. Today, a man claimed to have 10 mouths to feed. We fed him twice. Later, we saw him laughing with his friend, who had done the same. Is this deceit, or is it a test of our mercy? That line, a test of our mercy, is perhaps the truest thing ever written about medieval charity. Because for all the rules, all the theology, all the carefully measured rations and record-keeping, mercy was not something that could be portioned. It had to be chosen. And sometimes, those who needed it most had to break the very rules that denied them. Of course, the church did not take kindly to deception. By the 14th century, some monasteries began posting guards at the gates. Lists were drawn up, names of trusted poor, vetted by priests. Those found lying about their household size were blacklisted. Some towns began requiring tokens to receive bread, wooden discs marked with a family's name, meant to prevent repeat visits. Others handed out salt instead of bread, a subtle punishment. Useful, but not nourishing. One abbot in York ordered that anyone found bearing false witness in hunger be publicly flogged as a deterrent. But hunger does not fear punishment. Hunger waits behind the eyes of a child as she watches her parents return home empty-handed. Hunger hides in the silence of a man who hasn't eaten in 2 days, whose pride has already been peeled away by cold and shame. Hunger drives people to do what morality cannot explain. And so, the lies continued. What's astonishing is how widespread and quietly accepted this became. Monks knew, of course. Not all were blind. Many were sympathetic. Some even quietly gave extra bread to those they knew were lying, choosing humanity over protocol. A few, in their journals, admitted to turning their eyes away. One wrote, "I know the woman has no sick child, but I gave her the loaf. Perhaps tomorrow she will." Today, when we study the history of medieval Europe, we talk about battles, kings, cathedrals, but the true war was fought in places like the Almonry Gate, in whispers, in lies, in cracked hands holding out for mercy. These weren't criminals. They were people trying to live through a winter that had no end. We must ask, what is more sacred, the truth that starves or the lie that feeds? These peasants, forgotten by history, remind us that survival sometimes demands deception, and that in the face of hunger, trust is a luxury only the full can afford. So remember this. In the winter of 13th century Europe, when the bread was nearly gone and the monks recited scripture behind thick stone walls, the poor told stories not to deceive the church, but to outlive the silence of God. They lied not to betray faith, but to preserve life. And sometimes, that's the holiest act of all. Freezing families hid sick relatives from death. Tithes. In the bone-deep cold of a 14th century winter, in towns where the wind cut through stone and the bread ran out weeks before the snow, families huddled around fires that were little more than memory. And when someone died, when the body finally gave out under starvation, illness, or frostbite, what followed was not peace, it was panic. Because death, in many towns across medieval Europe, came with a tax, a tithe, a final price. Burial was not free. To place a body in consecrated ground, to lay your mother, your son, your husband beneath the soil, meant paying the church. Sometimes a coin, sometimes goods, sometimes livestock. But in a world where families survived winter on a single sack of grain and a prayer, even one coin could mean the difference between life and death for the living. So, they made a choice. They hid the dead. They wrapped the bodies in cloth, laid them beneath beds, sealed them in cold corners of cellars, or leaned them quietly against the far wall of a frozen room. They prayed the smell wouldn't come quickly, that no one would notice, that no church official would ask why the candles in the window had gone out. And sometimes, they didn't wait for death at all. When a relative grew ill, coughing blood, failing to rise, slipping into fever, they were pulled from public view, not out of shame, not from denial, but out of economic desperation. Because once the death was known, the clock began. Word traveled fast in small towns, the local priest would arrive, the clerk would write the name, the burial had to be arranged, and the payment, no matter how small, was enforced. The church needed to maintain records, the cemetery needed maintenance, the ritual had to be preserved. But what about the family with nothing? What about the widow with 4 children and no livestock? What about the old couple who survived on crusts and melted snow? For them, paying the death tithe wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. So, they waited. They delayed the report. They left the body where it fell and lived alongside it, hoping no one would find out. There are recorded cases, especially from colder regions, of corpses being hidden for weeks. In villages from Scotland to Bohemia, officials later discovered bodies frozen in corners, wrapped in winter blankets, wedged behind firewood stacks, or sealed in root cellars next to pickled vegetables and drying meat. The death wasn't denied, it was simply delayed, until spring, when the air warmed, the soil softened, and the taxes felt slightly less like punishment. But there were consequences. Burial laws in many parishes required notification within days. To delay was to defy both religious and civil authority. In some areas, hiding a corpse became a punishable offense. Fines, public shaming. In rare cases, imprisonment. Still, families took the risk, because paying the price meant losing their last coin, and losing the last coin meant losing the living. They justified it however they could. God would understand. The body was safe. The soul had already departed. They would bury properly when the time came, but no matter the justification, the act left a scar. Children grew up remembering the winter they lived beside the dead. Women lit candles in silence, refusing to cry too loudly. Husbands dug shallow holes when no one watched and buried loved ones beneath garden stones. And yet, these stories rarely made it into the written record, because shame silences, because the church wrote history, and the poor simply endured it. But every so often, fragments surface, a ledger line noting a delayed burial, a priest's angry remark about unreported deaths, a fine recorded months after a person was known to have died. And from those fragments, we glimpse a hidden world, a quiet defiance of a system that charged people for dying, a world where grief became strategy, where love became secrecy, where mourning was put on hold so that one more child could survive the cold. And so, when we walk through old cemeteries, reading names carved into lichen-covered stones, we forget that some names never made it there. Some bodies were buried quietly, without record. Some families never lit the final candle, because death cost money. And for the poorest of the poor, even death had to wait its turn. Eating forbidden meats during Lent could save your life. In the stark, wind-beaten winters of medieval Europe, hunger was not a metaphor. It was a daily war waged in the bellies of peasants, fought with empty bowls, hollow cheeks, and the gnawing cold of starvation. And when Lent arrived, 40 days of enforced fasting and abstinence, this war turned crueler. The church had long decreed that no flesh of land animals could be consumed during Lent. Fish was permitted. Eggs and dairy were restricted or forbidden, depending on the region and the time. For the nobility, these restrictions were manageable, an inconvenience softened by salted salmon, almond milk, eel pies, and elaborate substitutes. But for the poor, Lent could be lethal. Peasant diets were already thin during the long tale of winter. Root cellars stood nearly bare. Bread made from coarse barley or rye was sometimes stretched with sawdust or mashed acorns. And the frost, still clinging to the ground, made foraging nearly impossible. It was in these bleak conditions that the church insisted on sacrifice, not just of comfort, but of sustenance itself. And so, out of sight, under cloaks of forest fog or barn smoke, the people broke the law. Not in protest, not in arrogance, but in silence, out of need. In the hollows of forests, they hunted squirrel. From burrows, they coaxed badgers. Hedgehogs were trapped. Songbirds were plucked from trees. And sometimes, when the desperation became unbearable, a sheep would vanish from a noble's field, its bones buried quickly, its blood scrubbed from the snow before sunrise. These were not acts of gluttony. These were acts of survival. But the penalties were severe. Eating meat during Lent, especially red meat, was considered a grave sin. Public knowledge of it could result in excommunication. You would be denied communion, denied burial in sacred ground, denied forgiveness until public penance was done, often on your knees in rags before the congregation, confessing your hunger as if it were pride. Church records reveal the intensity of enforcement. In one 14th century French village, a man was whipped in the square for roasting a stolen piglet during Lent. In England, a woman was dragged before the ecclesiastical court for boiling a squirrel stew in secret, discovered by the scent wafting from her chimney. She wept as she confessed, not from shame, but from the knowledge that she had fed her dying child, and that the price for doing so might be her soul. The irony was bitter. The church preached mercy. Yet in winter, it denied the most merciful act of all, allowing the poor to live. Some clergy looked the other way. A few rural priests, themselves sons of farmers, quietly forgave confessions made in whisper. Others would turn a blind eye if no meat bones were found in the midden heap. But not all were so compassionate. Bishoprics and abbots, especially those closer to urban centers, were eager to display their spiritual rigor. They sent inspectors. They read sermons aloud in market squares, condemning the sin of flesh-eating during Lent and reminding villagers that the fires of hell were hungrier than their bellies. The spiritual justification was clear. Lent was a test of the soul. Christ had fasted in the wilderness. The faithful must suffer as he had. But Christ had not been born in a thatched hut, with 7 mouths to feed and 1 crust of bread to divide. He had not watched his children cry from hunger as snow fell on their beds. And so, every year, the hidden feasts continued. Not feasts in the noble sense, but desperate meals of fried rodent, roasted badger, or bitter stew made from stolen offal. In the eyes of the church, these were sins. But to the people who lived them, they were sacred acts of preservation. Cultural memory tells us Lent was about piety, but in the villages, Lent was about trade-offs, salvation versus starvation. And every bite of forbidden meat was a gamble not just with one's soul, but with one's reputation, one's standing in the community, and one's place in eternity. What makes these stories more tragic is how invisible they became. Church chronicles recorded the names of the punished, but never the names of the saved. The child who lived because a mother fed him squirrel is not in the manuscripts. The old man who avoided freezing to death because he ate stolen fat is nowhere to be found, but they existed. Their survival is etched not in parchment, but in lineage, in the fact that someone lived, passed on a name, and endured. And even now, centuries later, we're left with a question that haunts the soul more deeply than doctrine ever could. Is it truly sin to eat what you must to keep your child alive? In the forests and fields of medieval Europe, under the long shadow of a church that demanded sacrifice, the people made their own theology, one whispered between mouthfuls of forbidden meat, a theology that said, "I will not let my family die for a rule made by someone who's never gone hungry," because sometimes salvation doesn't come in a chalice or a sermon. Sometimes it comes in the form of a squirrel roasted in the dark. Sneaking into Abbey kitchens meant survival or prison. They didn't go for treasure. They weren't there for gold chalices or holy relics. They went for porridge, barely warm, half-spoiled, ladled hours ago, and left for waste. The year was 1372, a brutal spring in the English countryside. Crops from the previous year had failed, and famine licked the edges of every town like wildfire. Mothers rationed bread into dust. Fathers disappeared looking for work. And children, barefoot, hollow-eyed, learned that hunger didn't wait for daylight. In the town of Ely, 2 children, brothers, according to the record, slipped through the ivy-draped wall of a Benedictine abbey. They weren't the first. The kitchen was known to leave its doors cracked in the early hours, warmth escaping into the cold. Inside, porridge, thin, starchy, bland. But to a starving child, it was life. They didn't make it out. A monk saw their shadows flickering near the fire. A shout rang out. The boys dropped the wooden bowl they had taken, its contents spilling across the stone floor. They ran. But hunger had made them slow. They were caught, dragged to the courtyard, and whipped. The abbey didn't try them in court. It didn't need to. Under canon law, monasteries held local authority. They administered punishment for trespassers, especially those who stole from the abbey's stores, especially the poor. The whipping was public. It was a spectacle, not just to humiliate the boys, but to warn the others. Do not take what belongs to God, even if your stomach begs for mercy. One chronicler wrote it plainly. 2 youths, having broken the kitchen peace, were lashed before the people as example. There was no mention of their names, no mention of their parents, no mention of the fact that they were, in all likelihood, starving to death. Because monasteries, for all their charity, drew hard lines. Abbeys were among the wealthiest landholders in medieval Europe. They grew their own grain, tended their own flocks. They baked bread, brewed ale, and cooked vast stews for their own brothers in Christ. And yes, they gave to the poor, but on their terms, once a week, at designated times, with rules. To break those rules was to challenge their authority. And so, time and time again, the desperate came at night. Widows with hollow cheeks, children too young to understand sin. They crawled through shrubbery, climbed low stone walls, crept through orchard paths to reach the kitchens, for crusts, for broth, for animal bones. Some got away, some were caught. And when they were, their punishment was swift. Whipping, imprisonment, public shame. In some cases they were branded. In others, the family, if known, was blacklisted from any future aid. And still, they came. Because to the poor, abbey kitchens were not sacred. They were survival. Inside, monks ate twice a day, in silence. Their meals weren't lavish, but they were steady. Bread, porridge, fish, lentils, enough to live, enough to make a child's mouth water from outside the iron grate. And when you've watched your little sister faint from hunger, when your mother lies and says she's full so you can have her half of the meal, the holiness of a place no longer matters. Only food does. So, these children risked everything, for porridge, for one bowl, for one more day alive. And we punished them for it. We didn't ask why they came. We didn't ask who failed them. We only whipped them and moved on. We look back now and call it justice, order, sacred law. But what is sacred about feeding the strong and punishing the weak? What is just about striking a child for being hungry? The stones of those abbey walls are still standing, some worn, some collapsed. The kitchens are quiet now, no broth bubbling in iron cauldrons, no barefoot children hiding in the hedges. But the silence they left behind is louder than the bells that once rang for Mass. A silence filled with names unrecorded, lives forgotten, floggings administered in the name of God, all for the crime of wanting to eat. So remember them. Not just the 2 boys caught in Ely in 1372, but all of them. The children who braved the cold, the mothers who whispered prayers before sending them, the starving who believed, even for one moment, that salvation might come in the shape of a warm kitchen. They didn't want to be thieves. They wanted to survive, and in that, they were braver than we'll ever know. Wearing stolen fur could keep you warm and get you executed. In the dead of winter, in the year 1354, a servant boy walked the snow-covered streets of London wearing something he should not have touched, a fox-lined cloak stitched for a nobleman, and for that, he was hanged. The cloak was beautiful, thick wool dyed deep crimson, the collar and cuffs lined with the soft, glinting fur of red fox, an unmistakable marker of status. In medieval England, garments were not just clothing, they were law. Sumptuary laws strictly dictated who could wear what. The wrong colors, the wrong fabric, or the wrong trim could mean public flogging, or worse. Fur, especially fox or ermine, was a symbol of rank, reserved exclusively for lords, ladies, and those favored by the crown. For a servant to wear such a cloak, even in the middle of a snowstorm, was considered treasonous. But on that bitter January morning, the boy, barefoot, starving, blue with cold, had no choice. He worked in a minor nobleman's estate just outside the city walls, one of dozens of invisible hands, sweeping, hauling, shoveling snow from the privy yard. That morning, he found the cloak discarded in a laundry cart, left out too long. It was stiff with frost, but intact. He should have turned it in. Instead, he slipped it over his shoulders. For a few hours, it saved his life. The wind no longer cut through his chest. His fingers stopped trembling. His skin, chapped and raw, finally stopped burning in the cold. He kept his head down, walked quickly. But someone saw him, and they didn't see a freezing child. They saw a thief. A steward from another estate recognized the garment stitching. He had seen the cloak on Lord Darrington's back not 2 days prior. The boy was stopped, confronted, dragged by his collar through the slush and filth of the London streets until he stood in front of the sheriff's house, surrounded by guards, gentry, and onlookers. The trial lasted less than an hour. He confessed to taking the cloak, not for greed, not to sell, but to survive. It didn't matter. The law did not weigh intent. To wear noble fur without title was considered impersonation of rank, a capital offense under city statute. And because the cloak had been stolen, the sentence was clear: death. He was hanged the next morning at Tyburn, in view of the public. The cloak was displayed on a wooden post beside him, as a reminder to all: status was sacred, and even warmth had a price. The city returned to its routines. Merchants opened their stalls, clerks made notes in their ledgers. The snow fell quietly, dusting the gallows where a child had died for not wanting to freeze. His name is not recorded, but his story spread through the servant quarters of every manor in the region. Because it wasn't rare, it wasn't unique. It was a reality every low-born person understood. Survival was dangerous. Even the act of staying warm, of reaching for a discarded coat, a fur-lined scrap, a thread of comfort, could brand you a criminal. In a world where clothing signified your place in the divine order, breaking that code, no matter the reason, was an act of defiance. Even if your bones were freezing, even if your skin split in the cold, even if you would die without it. Some say the cloak was cursed afterward, that no noble wore it again, that its fox fur, once shimmering, dulled to gray, that it never held warmth again. But the truth is colder. The cloak likely returned to its place in a wardrobe, cleaned, pressed, its past erased. Only the servants remembered. Only they passed down the tale, whispering to each other in the kitchens, over frozen wash basins, and by unlit hearths. A lesson wrapped in silence. Better to freeze than to wear what isn't yours. Better to suffer than to step beyond your place. Better to die than to look like a lord. But they also remembered something else. That for one brief moment, in a snowstorm, a boy had felt warm, that the cloak had held him like no law ever would, that he had dared to defy the world not with anger, but with need. And in that act, however small, however fatal, he became more than a servant. He became a mirror, a reminder that cruelty doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through laws, and sometimes it wears fur. Trading in the black market was the only way to eat some winters. In the dead of a medieval winter, when the ground froze like iron and the sky hung low with leaden silence, there were only two ways to survive: obey the law and starve, or break it and eat. Across medieval Europe, in the shadow of castles and cathedrals, beneath the spires of parish churches and the banners of noble courts, laws governed every bite of bread, every scrap of meat, every log of firewood burned. The church controlled the soul, the Lord controlled the land, and together they controlled the markets. Who could sell? What could be bought? When it could be traded? Prices were fixed, tithes were taken, grain was hoarded. And during winter, especially the harsh winters that came like punishment, these rules became death sentences. That's why the black market was not a corner of criminality. It was a lifeline. It's easy now to imagine medieval black markets as shadows in back alleys, whispers passed in torchlight. And in some ways, that image is true. But these were not dens of thieves. They were survival networks. Peasants selling meat from animals slaughtered without permission. Widows trading firewood cut from the Lord's forest. Bakers passing flatbread through cellars and cracks in stable doors. It was illegal. It was dangerous. But it was the only way the poor could eat. Let's step back for a moment. The manorial economy of medieval Europe operated on strict control. A village existed within a feudal hierarchy, and its markets were closely regulated. Food production was taxed by the church through the tithe. 10% of every harvest went to God's house. The rest was often owed to the Lord, who controlled the local mill, the oven, and the fields. Want to grind your grain? Pay the miller. Want to bake your bread? Use the Lord's oven and pay for the privilege. Want to sell anything at market? Ask permission and pay the toll. So when the harvest failed, or the roads were snowed under, or your last coin was long gone, legal options disappeared. And that's when people turned to what was not legal, but still, somehow, just. Black markets weren't advertised. They emerged in barnyards, back rooms, and woods at twilight. Sometimes, a traveling peddler would arrive in the village square with a cart that wasn't supposed to exist, laden with dried meat from a poached deer, flour bought without tax, herbs gathered from forbidden land. But he wouldn't cry his wares aloud. He'd speak quietly, trade in glances, lean in close, and vanish before the reeve or bailiff came sniffing around. It wasn't just food. Firewood was as valuable as bread. In winter, the forests surrounding the villages were technically off limits. Hunting and gathering there without a noble's license was poaching. Cutting wood was theft. But laws didn't keep a man warm. So people crept into the woods at night, bundled stolen branches in cloth, and crept back before dawn. Sometimes they were caught, hands chopped off, fines levied they could never pay. A boy might be flogged for stealing kindling, a woman hanged for trading a hare. But still the trade continued, because laws don't feed children, and no one ever froze to death because they stole a loaf of bread. They froze because someone else owned it. In some regions, especially in France, Flanders, and northern England, black market networks grew into underground economies. Entire villages were in on it. The priest would look the other way. The steward might take a cut of the profit. Sometimes, even the Lord's own servants sold off excess food behind his back. There are recorded cases of monasteries that issued extra bread from their stores and then lost it on purpose, knowing full well it would find its way into the hands of the starving through black market channels they never acknowledged. One winter, in the year 1322, a chronicler in Rouen wrote, "The poor trade amongst themselves in ways the law does not permit. Bread moves in darkness. Meat without mark changes hands. Wood from the forest burns in unholy hearths, and yet they live. And I wonder who sins more, the thief or he who let the bread rot while children starved." It was not a rare question. During the worst winters, those where entire fields lay under ice and livestock perished in the snow, the line between sin and survival disappeared, and so did the appetite for strict law. Even sheriffs and reeves turned away from enforcing regulations that would lead to riots. Some towns made unofficial agreements. No arrests during the cold months. Others turned to punishments meant to shame, not to kill. Stocks, branding, public penance, because even those in power began to see what hunger could do. But the church, oh, the church, remained torn. To steal was a sin, but to let the poor die was also a sin. And so, sermons filled the air. Preachers denounced illegal trade on Sunday and fed the hungry through secret acts of mercy by Monday. Almoners distributed alms in daylight, and some slipped bread into the black market after dark. Hypocrisy? Perhaps. But also humanity. And that's what the black market was. Not lawlessness, but a deeply human cry for dignity. To understand this fully, you must imagine the face of a mother who hasn't fed her children in 2 days. Imagine the heatless hearth, the empty cupboard, the last crust shared between 4 mouths. Then imagine a neighbor offering a bit of cheese, unmarked, untaxed, illegal. She knows if she's caught, she could be whipped, evicted, banished. But she takes it. She feeds her children. And they live another day. Is that a crime? Or is that grace? The official records rarely mention black markets. Lords did not advertise their failure to control the food supply. Monasteries did not confess to aiding the poor through shadow trade. But the people remembered. Oral traditions passed down stories of bread traders and winter sellers, of the brave and quiet folk who risked everything so that others might eat. They were not rebels, not saints, just people who refused to accept starvation as fate. In the end, winter passed, but every year it came again, and with it the markets reopened, the legal ones and the ones beneath. Because survival is never neat, it's rarely noble, it is raw, imperfect, sometimes dishonest, but always deeply human. So the next time you hear the term black market, don't imagine shadows full of greed and crime. Imagine a warm loaf passed in silence, a handful of kindling exchanged for nothing but gratitude, a stolen log burning in a fireplace that kept a child alive one more night. And know that some of the most illegal things ever done in history were also the most necessary. Families burned, forbidden, so religious texts for heat. In the winter of 1410, the city of Prague was silent beneath a blanket of ice. The Vltava River froze, market stalls emptied, fires were rationed like gold, and in the cramped stone alleys, where the poor huddled with their children beneath leaking roofs, survival was no longer about food. It was about heat. That year, the cold came early and stayed late. Frost crept across walls like a slow-living thing. Water jugs cracked, rats fled, and even the wealthiest began to burn furniture just to keep their estates warm. But for one family, tucked behind the outer edge of the old town walls, there was nothing left to burn. No wood, no coal, no straw, nothing, except a chest. Inside were old scrolls, religious scrolls, dust-covered, brittle, left behind by a fleeing priest a decade earlier, written in Latin, sealed in symbols, forbidden to be handled by the unordained. The scrolls were sacred and flammable. The father hesitated. He knew what they were, knew what they meant. He'd been warned since childhood that scripture, even unread, was not to be touched, and certainly never to be burned. But his daughter was shaking from the cold. His wife's hands had turned blue, and silence filled the room like ash. So he chose heat. One scroll at a time, they fed the fire. They didn't read. They didn't pray. They just watched the flames rise, each page blackening into warmth, each sacred letter becoming smoke, not out of hate, not out of blasphemy, but out of desperation. And for a few hours, they were warm. The walls steamed, the frost melted from the windows, the children slept without shivering. But the warmth came at a cost. The smoke carried the scent of old ink, different, strange, and it caught the nose of a neighbor, a churchman, suspicious, dutiful, loyal. He followed the scent, saw the faint glow from their chimney, and alerted the city guards. By morning, they were arrested, not for theft, not for violence, but for heresy, for destroying sacred scripture, for desecrating words meant only for the church, for choosing survival over sanctity. They were dragged before the bishop's court. The father explained. He begged. He wept. He said he would never have touched the scrolls if there had been another way. But mercy was not in fashion. Prague, in 1410, was on the edge of religious fracture. The early tremors of the Hussite movement had begun. The church felt threatened. Any challenge, real or symbolic, was punished to set an example. So, the verdict came quickly. Guilty. The father was beaten publicly. The mother imprisoned for moral failure. The children sent to a monastery for re-education. All because they burned words to survive a night that might have killed them. History is filled with grand stories of heretics, reformers, and rebels. But this was none of those. This was a family, cold and cornered, who chose to make fire from something that no longer fed the soul, only the skin, and they paid dearly for it. This isn't an isolated tale. Across Europe, during harsh winters, religious texts were hidden away like relics, and sometimes, when desperation overcame dogma, they were used, burned, consumed by necessity. Because in the medieval world, warmth was survival, and sometimes survival came at the cost of sacred things. The irony? Most of those scrolls were never going to be read again. They were written in languages no one in that household spoke, meant for rituals that no longer happened, locked behind interpretation, owned by institutions, and guarded by fear. And yet, their destruction carried more punishment than theft, because in the eyes of power, symbols mattered more than lives. And still, the family burned them anyway, not to defy God, but to protect each other. That fire was not heresy. It was love, wrapped in heat, fueled by fear, and chosen in silence by people who just wanted to survive one more night. So when we speak of medieval devotion, of punishment, of purity, remember this. In Prague, in 1410, a man burned scripture not to rebel, but to keep his children alive, and for that, he was condemned. Townsfolk dug up animal carcasses from snow-covered graves. In the blackened winters of medieval Europe, when the ground turned to iron and the wind howled like a curse through wooden shutters, hunger became something more than a condition. It became a kind of madness. When the grain stores emptied, when even the rats had vanished from the alleys and the bones in the soup pot had been boiled down to chalk, some turned to desperation so profound it crossed into the unthinkable. They dug up the dead. Not the human dead, though even that boundary would blur during history's darkest famines, but the carcasses of animals buried weeks or months before, laid beneath layers of snow and frozen earth. These were not hunters, not scavengers by nature. They were fathers, mothers, grandmothers, and children, ordinary people with no choice left except to exhume what the world had already discarded. Beneath the frost-hardened fields outside village walls, near stables, or in hastily dug pits behind slaughterhouses, livestock carcasses had been buried. Some had died of disease, others had been left to rot because their meat was thought unsafe or unclean. But when the cold stretched too long, and the firewood ran out, and the bread turned to dust, these graves became something else entirely. Forbidden larders. Lawmakers and clergy alike condemned the act. To dig up a dead animal, especially one considered unfit for consumption, was not just a health risk. It was seen as a desecration, a profanation of order. There were laws across France, Germany, and England that specifically forbade the disturbance of buried beasts, often citing divine judgment or public safety. Punishments ranged from public flogging to excommunication. In some towns, offenders were forced to parade through the village with the skull of the animal they had exhumed as a mark of their crime. But the punishments never stopped the practice, because no law could reason with the sight of a starving child. In one recorded account from the German states in the winter of 1438, a woman was caught boiling the flesh of a horse carcass her sons had unearthed from a snowbound grave outside the village. When questioned by the local priest, she didn't deny it. She simply wept and said, "My boy had not spoken in 2 days." Then he said the word meat. What would you have me do? And there were countless more, unrecorded, unpunished, unnoticed, who ventured out in the dark. When the frost numbed their fingers and the moon lit their shame, they carried shovels or bare hands. Sometimes, the bodies they uncovered were so solid with cold, they had to hack the meat free with knives and stones. Frozen sinew and bone were dragged home, thawed by weak fires, and stewed until the scent of death turned to food. It wasn't noble, it wasn't safe, but it was survival. The church, of course, issued proclamations. Preachers warned that eating diseased or buried flesh was to invite hell into the body, that it tainted the soul as much as the stomach. But the hungry weren't thinking about eternity. They were thinking about mourning. Just one more mourning. In England, during the brutal winter of 1316, following the Great Famine that had begun the year prior, there are whispers, marginal notes in monastery books, of villagers exhuming pigs, goats, and even dogs from shallow graves. The clerics wrote of it as a moral collapse, but they didn't see the children who lived because of it. They didn't name the ones who died anyway. And in the snow-covered towns where nothing grew and mercy had frozen solid, this act became a silent tradition, passed in whispers, in glances between neighbors, a knowledge passed through suffering. If you know where the old ox was buried, wait until midnight. Dig quickly, don't let the priest see, and for God's sake, boil it long. The psychological weight was immense. People ate with guilt choking their throats. Some prayed over the carcass as though it were a sacrament, begging forgiveness before each bite. Others said nothing at all. They knew that what they were doing broke the law, broke the church's rules, broke the natural order. But nothing breaks like the human spirit in a cold house with empty mouths, so the law called it desecration. The church called it sin. But the people called it something else entirely. Hope. Hope that tomorrow the snow might melt, that spring might come, that no one else would have to dig through the dead to feed the living, because history is not just made in courts and castles. Sometimes it is made with trembling hands, clawing through snow and frozen dirt, searching for something, anything, that might keep a heartbeat going one day more. And that's where humanity lived in those forgotten winters, not in light, but in frost and hunger, and the quiet courage of those who chose to live, even when the cost was unthinkable. Skipping church to hunt, small game was seen as heresy. He didn't skip church out of rebellion. He skipped because he was hungry. In the frozen fields of Normandy in 1335, winters were merciless. The ground was hard, food was scarce, and the church bells didn't ring with comfort. They rang with expectation. Every man, woman, and child was required to attend Mass, to kneel, to listen, to obey, even when their stomachs growled louder than the priest's voice. But one man, a farmhand, unnamed in the record, disappeared during sermons. Not once, not twice, but often. Where did he go? Into the woods, with a snare, a crude bow, a sack stitched from old tunics. He hunted rabbits, small birds, anything that moved. His absence was noted, whispered about, reported, and then condemned. The local clergy labeled him not just disobedient, but heretical, because in 14th century Normandy, to miss Mass was not a small offense. It was a spiritual crime, and repeated absence, especially for worldly pursuits like hunting, was treated with suspicion. It wasn't merely laziness, it was defiance, and defiance was dangerous. Heresy was not always about doctrine. It wasn't just claiming the Pope was false or preaching alternate gospels. Heresy could be lived in action. And this man, by placing meat above Mass, hunger above holiness, had, according to the Church, placed his soul in grave peril. The local record from 1335 says it simply, "He forsook the holy office for the chasing of beasts. Let him be judged among the heretical for his stubborn flesh." They brought him before a tribunal, not in some great cathedral, but in a stone chapel lit by flickering candles and cold judgment. He was questioned. Was he consorting with pagans in the forest? Was he invoking spirits? Did he seek sustenance or something darker? There was no evidence of magic, no alternate religion, just a man who had tried to keep himself alive when the fields gave nothing and his family went without. But that didn't matter. The church could not afford disobedience, not then, not in a world teetering on the edge of spiritual paranoia and famine. Mass was not just ritual, it was control. It ensured the poor believed their suffering had meaning. That obedience, even in starvation, was noble. To break from that was dangerous. And so they punished him, not with death, but with ruin. Public penance, flogging, exile, branding in some cases. They made him kneel outside the chapel doors during Mass, wearing a sign, "Hunter of beasts, not of God." The villagers were told to shun him, not because he had stolen, not because he had lied, but because he had skipped church. For rabbits. For scraps of meat to boil into soup. This wasn't an isolated event. In medieval Europe, countless men, especially in the winter months, disappeared from pews and reappeared with snares, furs, feathers. Entire rural communities developed whispered codes. One toll of the bell for actual mass. Two for when it was safe to sneak away. They knew the risks. If caught, the consequences could be devastating. Because the church didn't just guard souls, it guarded time. Mass attendance was proof of submission, of obedience to divine order, and anything that challenged that, even silence, even absence, was seen as rebellion. It didn't matter if you had a starving child at home. It didn't matter if you caught a single bird in 2 weeks. Your salvation was expected to come through prayer, not pursuit. The irony, of course, is that many monasteries hunted regularly. Clergy ate rabbit stew, roasted pheasant, maintained their own game reserves. But the poor, their hunger was not seen as justifiable. Their hunting was not sanctioned. It was seen as greed, as pride, as spiritual failure. And so, they were punished for surviving. We look back now and wonder, how many men were branded heretics for choosing food over faith? How many were cast out of their communities not for crime, but for hunger? The woods of Normandy are quiet now. The bells still ring in stone churches, but in the frost-covered soil are bones that once moved through branches in search of meat. Bones of men who didn't curse God, but who could no longer wait on him for a miracle. Their crime was simple. They skipped church, and for that, they were judged by men who never missed a meal. Mothers cut locks from nobles' horses for fire, Tinder. In the bitter winter of 1398, as snow blanketed the hills and rivers froze into silence, a woman slipped into a nobleman's stable under cover of night, not to steal silver or grain, but to cut the tail from a horse. She carried no torch, only a dull knife, wrapped in cloth to stop it from clinking. Her hands were cracked from cold, her breath sharp in the air, and in her mind she repeated a single truth: horsehair burns. It was something every peasant mother knew. Long strands from a mane or tail, twisted and dry, caught fire quickly when the wood was too wet or the coals too few. It wasn't fuel, but it could start fuel. And in a winter like that one, where the wind seeped into your children's lungs and frost made brittle the bones of infants, fire was everything. The noblemen's horses, strong, groomed, warm in their stalls, had hair thick with oils and care. The woman knew how to cut carefully. Only a little. Just enough for a tinder bundle. She had done it before. But that night, she was caught. A stable hand spotted her crouching behind a stall, a fistful of tail hair in one hand, a trembling blade in the other. He shouted. She ran, but not far. By morning, she stood before the manor reeve, her head bowed, her fingers still holding the evidence. The charge, theft of lordly property. The punishment, jail. Not a fine, not a warning. A stone cell with no window and no straw. Because in the eyes of the law, the horse did not belong to her world. It was noble, sacred, and every inch of it, even the strands that fell to the floor, belonged to its master. She had trespassed not just onto land, but across class. In that same year, the statute rolls of England make passing mention of unlawful handling of steed and tack by women of no title, a phrase that means nothing to most. But behind it lies a brutal truth. Peasant women, mothers, daughters, wives, had learned to survive in silence. They scoured hedgerows for moss, burned dried roots and manure, fashioned cook fires from anything that could spark. And when there was nothing left to burn, they looked to the animals, not to kill, not to harm, but to take what nobles never noticed: mane, tail, sheddings on the floor. Not enough to be seen. Just enough to live. But to the lords, that theft wasn't petty. It was symbolic. Their horses were pride incarnate, bred for battle, paraded in festivals, shown off like armor. Touching them, even in desperation, was touching power. And that could not go unanswered. The woman from 1398 spent 17 days in jail. Her youngest child died of cold on the 6th. She returned home silent, changed. She never spoke of the jail, but her neighbors did. They remembered, and they whispered, not just about her, but about all the mothers who had done the same, because she wasn't alone. The practice was widespread, quiet, invisible. In manors across England, tufts of missing hair were blamed on rats or shedding. But the stable hands knew. They just didn't always tell, because they had mothers too. In many places, the punishment became more severe. Repeat offenders could lose fingers, be whipped in the square. Some were exiled from the manor lands entirely, cast into winter with no home and no fire at all. And yet, the cutting never stopped, because the cold doesn't care for class. And when a child is coughing through the night, when breath fogs the air inside the cottage, when your hands shake as you strike wet flint against stone, what else can you do? You go to the horses, you cut a handful, you burn it, and you hope you're not seen. That is what makes this story so haunting. Not just the punishment, but the choice. A mother forced to weigh her child's warmth against the wrath of power. A bundle of tail hair against a jail cell. One stolen spark against a world built to keep her cold. Today, horses are seen as sport, hobby, tradition. But in 1398, they were symbols of the line that peasants could not cross, and a single strand of hair was a hanging thread on which life or death was suspended. We may not know her name, but her act, desperate, quiet, brave, deserves to be remembered. Not because it changed history, but because it reveals it. Because sometimes survival is a crime, and sometimes a fire begins not with wood or coal, but with the soft, stolen tail of a nobleman's horse. Poor villagers dug illegally into grain stores at night. The winter of 1316 was not just cold, it was catastrophic. The air hung with frost, the rivers turned to stone, and across vast stretches of medieval Europe, the snow came down like a curse. In villages buried beneath the drifts, the weak coughed in their beds, the old slipped away in silence, and the children cried with empty bellies. By then, it was the second year of the Great Famine, and desperation had become more familiar than warmth. In one nameless village, somewhere in the heartland of France or England, historians don't say where, only when, desperation took on a new shape. 3 families, starving and out of options, took a risk that was both criminal and deeply human. They dug into the village's grain store in the dead of night. To understand how extraordinary and dangerous this act was, you have to understand what a grain store meant in 1316. In the medieval world, grain was life. It was wealth, currency, security, and survival all packed into burlap sacks and wooden bins. Every village had some form of communal storage, large barns, silos, or cellars, where the year's grain was kept under strict oversight. This store was rationed by local officials, watched over by churchmen or reeves, and sometimes guarded around the clock when winter threatened to turn hunger into chaos. The grain store wasn't just a building. It was the beating heart of village survival, and it was locked. By the winter of 1316, after months of failed harvests and rising death tolls, many grain stores were all but empty. What remained was rationed with bitter precision, often only to those considered most deserving, the obedient, the loyal, the useful. But famine does not care for hierarchy. It flattens all distinctions. And so, the 3 families, outcast by poverty perhaps, or simply forgotten by their local lord, decided to take back what they needed. They waited until the cold was deepest, when the guards had stopped keeping regular watch, when even dogs were too weak to bark. Then, under cover of snow and silence, they crept to the rear of the storage barn with crude tools. Rusted shovels, broken boards, maybe even their bare hands. The earth was frozen. The wood was thick. But inch by inch, they dug. They tunneled beneath the side wall, through packed dirt and hay-stuffed gaps. Their fingers cracked, their nails tore. And finally, after hours of work, they breached the side of the barn, just enough to squeeze in, fill their sacks with whatever grain they could carry, and vanish back into the white wilderness. It worked. For a while, they fed their children, maybe even smiled as the smell of porridge returned to their homes. But the tunnel did not go unnoticed. Days later, a steward discovered it during his rounds. The alarm was raised, and in the tight-knit structure of a medieval village, where secrets were impossible to keep and silence often bought with starvation, someone talked. The 3 families were identified, hauled before a tribunal. Not a court of law as we might imagine it, but a gathering of local officials, priests, and landowners. The verdict was swift. They were not executed. That would have made martyrs. Instead, they were exiled. Exile was a sentence worse than it sounds. In the Middle Ages, being banished from your village meant more than losing your home. It meant losing your identity, your protection, your access to land, markets, and sanctuary. A family cast out into the frozen countryside had little chance of survival. They couldn't legally enter other villages. They could be attacked without consequence. In some cases, they were branded or marked to show they had been judged. We don't know what happened to them after that, whether they froze, whether they starved, whether they found some distant church or town to take them in. History does not always preserve the endings, only the echoes. But what it does preserve is the fear this event created. Grain stores were reinforced. Some were booby-trapped with iron jaws or set under church watch. In a few regions, rumors spread that even attempting to steal grain would damn your soul. The church, caught between charity and control, preached sermons warning against theft, but also quietly expanded its own almonries to feed those too weak to steal. And still, the digging continued. In later winters, more tunnels were found, more breaches attempted. Some were caught. Some succeeded. Some died in the act, crushed by collapsing snow or suffocated under barns too tightly sealed. But the hunger never stopped, and neither did the quiet rebellion beneath the ground. Because that's what this was. Not a rebellion of pitchforks and flames, but of shovels and silence. The peasants were not trying to burn down the manor or overthrow the church. They were just trying to stay alive. They were told to wait for the Lord's mercy, for the priest's ration, for God's providence. But the food was there, rotting behind walls, guarded while children starved. So they dug. Imagine the sound of it. Not loud, not heroic, just scraping. Bare hands clawing through frozen dirt. A mother weeping softly as her child coughs in the darkness. A father trembling as he risks everything for a few handfuls of grain. These were not criminals. These were people backed so far into a corner that crime became the last shape of love. We romanticize the Middle Ages through castles, knights, and grand cathedrals. But the truth is found in stories like this. In the grain stores that were full while the streets were empty. In the tunnels beneath barns. In the snow-covered footprints of families who refused to watch their children die politely. They were exiled not because they were wicked, but because they dared to say that hunger should not be legal. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. People forged alms, tokens to get extra help from monasteries. In the year 1401, in a cold northern town tucked beneath the stone weight of monarchy and church, a blacksmith made a decision that would brand him a criminal, but in his heart he knew it as an act of mercy. His forge had gone quiet weeks ago. The nobles had stopped ordering tools, no horses needed shoeing, and the poor, well, the poor had nothing left to repair. But they came anyway, not with silver, but with hollow eyes and hunger. And every morning they walked to the monastery, because the monastery gave out alms. Not always money, rarely in fact, but bread, broth, and sometimes wool scraps. But to get them, you needed a token. Small discs of metal or wood, issued weekly by the church to those deemed worthy. Each one was marked with a cross or emblem, one token per person, one meal per day. The system, the monks claimed, was holy, controlled, charitable, but only in moderation. They didn't want dependency, they wanted order. But order starved people just the same, families with 5 mouths and 1 token, elders too weak to walk, whose tokens lay unused. Children turned away because their mother had already collected her share. So the blacksmith, nameless now, erased from official records, made a choice. He began forging tokens, quietly, carefully. He melted scrap iron beneath a false floor in his workshop, carved crude but convincing symbols into flattened washers and nailed together discs of birch. He studied the monastery's markings and mimicked them with primitive tools. He didn't sell them. He didn't use them for himself. He gave them away, to mothers with infants, to widows, to the boy who'd lost his fingers in the mill, quietly, hand to hand, before dawn. And it worked. The monks never noticed the first wave. The food line grew, but not enough to spark suspicion. A few extra bowls, a few extra loaves, all easily explained away. But generosity always grows. Soon, more came. The tokens spread like whispered prayers. No one questioned their source, and for the first time in months, the town ate. But systems, especially sacred ones, do not like to be outsmarted. A monk eventually found a token with the wrong weight, too light. Another spotted a symbol slightly misaligned. The forgery became undeniable. An investigation was launched. The church feared a counterfeit ring. They doubled the inspections, disqualified dozens, closed the gates for days. And then someone spoke. The blacksmith's name was whispered to avoid punishment. They came for him at dusk, dragged him from his forge. His tools were seized, his fingers broken. He was tried, not just for forgery, but for spiritual fraud, for corrupting charity, for desecrating the sacred order of almsgiving. The punishment? Public branding. An iron pressed to his chest, marking him not with fire for his trade, but with shame. He survived, but he never forged again. He lived quietly after that, broken in body, but remembered differently, because not all saw him as a thief. Many remembered him as the man who helped their children eat, who warmed frozen hands, who risked his life for justice that institutions refused to give. He broke the law, but only because the law refused to bend to mercy. That's the hidden truth of the alms token system. It created hierarchy within the poor. Worthiness was judged by men in robes. Charity was controlled. Scarcity was designed. And yet, one man, with fire and metal, tried to fight that. Not with rebellion, but with kindness disguised as crime. And though history buried his name, the impact lingered. For years afterward, the monks added new features to tokens, more difficult to copy. But the town never forgot what those crude discs of iron once meant. Not fraud, but hope. Because when systems ration compassion, desperation becomes ingenuity. And when justice fails, kindness finds its forge. Forbidden herbal remedies were used to survive cold and sickness. In the year 1432, beneath a sky heavy with ash and snow, the fire in the village square of Wernfeld, Bavaria, did not warm. It burned. Its flames reached high into the winter air, not to heat the homes of the sick or feed the hungry, but to consume the body of a healer. Her name, mostly lost to time, was Agnes, midwife, herbalist, and, in the eyes of the church, a witch. Her crime? Boiling willow bark into tea and giving it to fevered villagers in the dead of winter. To us, the remedy sounds harmless, even wise. Willow bark contains salicin, a compound that modern medicine would later refine into aspirin. It reduces fever, eases pain, and soothes inflammation. But in the 15th century, knowledge like this, especially when wielded by a woman, especially one without clerical permission, was dangerous, deadly. The church had long claimed dominion over healing. Monasteries had their own herb gardens and infirmaries, their monks trained in Galenic medicine, using sanctioned texts passed down in Latin. Healing, they insisted, must come through holy knowledge, channeled through scripture, prayer, relics, and divine will. Anything else was suspect. Agnes had no license, no parchment, no bishop's blessing. What she had was lineage, wisdom passed from mother to daughter, stored not in books, but in memory, in dirt-stained fingers and whispered chants beneath the moonlight. The winter of 1432 was brutal. Grain froze in barns, livestock perished in icy stalls. Villagers coughed blood and raved with fever. Agnes walked door to door with pouches of dried bark, crushed rose hips, elderflower, and thyme. She brewed teas. She made poultices. And slowly those who drank her willow bark brew began to recover, while others died in their beds, clinging to crosses and waiting for divine intervention. And that is what sealed her fate. She healed where priests could not. She soothed where relics failed. Her remedies did not require confession or coin, and that, to the powerful, was not a miracle. It was a threat. Word spread quickly. A woman curing fevers without prayer, unblessed herbs saving souls better than saints. The rumors bloomed like frostbite, dangerous and unstoppable. Within weeks, Agnes was dragged before the bishop's tribunal. Her hands were bound. Her tools, bundles of dried plants, wooden spoons, a small kettle, were laid out like weapons before the court. She tried to explain that her tea reduced fevers, that she used what God had placed in the earth, that her only goal was to help. But the trial was not about truth. It was about order, about fear, about making an example. The court called her servant of the devil, accused her of summoning spirits with her brews. They said her knowledge of plants could not be natural, because a peasant woman had no right to understand the body better than a priest. And so, Agnes was condemned. Not because she harmed anyone, but because she healed without permission. The fire was lit at dawn. Villagers watched in silence, faces pale with horror and frost. Some of them, those who had sipped her tea and slept without pain, wept quietly. Others bowed their heads, afraid to speak. To mourn her publicly was to risk being next. The smoke rose into the gray sky, and with it, the last breath of a woman who could have been a physician had she been born in another age. Agnes was not alone. Across Europe, hundreds, perhaps thousands of herbalists were tried and killed for using unapproved remedies. Elderberry, foxglove, pennyroyal, yarrow, mugwort, plants that could heal were treated as blasphemy when held in unblessed hands. Healing was regulated like power, and those who healed without it were branded as heretics, witches, or worse. And yet, people kept using the forbidden herbs, because when your child is coughing blood, and the priest tells you to pray harder, and a woman in the woods offers a tea that might help, what would you choose? People risked everything for survival. For a few more days without fever, for a warm breath in the middle of winter, they visited healers in secret, paying in bread, wool, or silence. They buried their herbs out back, hid them in root cellars, carved protective signs over their doors. They lived in a state of constant fear, of sickness, of damnation, and of the law. But they kept living. And now, centuries later, we know they were right. That willow bark could ease pain. That elderberry boosts the immune system. That the earth was full of medicine long before the textbooks said so. But Agnes never lived to see her vindication. She burned for the crime of knowing too much too soon. So the next time you take an aspirin or sip an herbal tea to soothe a fever, remember the price that was once paid for that knowledge. It was paid in silence, in fire, in forgotten names carved into no gravestone. It was paid by women like Agnes, who chose to heal even when the world said healing was a sin. Servants risked their lives to stay overnight in forbidden towers. They knew the risk. Everyone did. The high tower was forbidden, reserved for the nobility, sealed at dusk, watched by guards. But that night, in the heart of winter, 2 servants climbed the stone steps anyway. Not for treasure, not for secrets, just for warmth. The year was 1290. The castle, name lost, buried in regional archives, stood somewhere in the north, surrounded by ice and silence. That winter was brutal. Records describe it as one of the coldest in living memory. Animals froze in barns. Bread turned solid overnight. People died mid-step, stiffened by wind and frost. And deep within the castle, in the lowest quarters, the servants suffered. They had no hearth, no insulation. Just straw on stone and the body heat of others, if they were lucky. The chill crept into their bones. Fingers cracked open from the cold. Breaths fogged the air like ghosts rising in the dark. They tried to sleep, but the shivers never stopped. Above them, however, above the kitchens, the halls, the chapel, rose the high tower. It was not luxurious by modern standards, but in the medieval world, it was paradise. The stone was thick, insulated by tapestries. The fire burned all night. The shutters closed tightly against the wind. And most importantly, it was warm. But warmth belonged to the nobles. Servants were forbidden to enter unless summoned. Even then, they were expected to keep their eyes low, their steps quiet, and leave immediately once their duty was done. So, when 2 servants were caught hiding there overnight in 1290, the punishment was swift and merciless. We don't know their names. All that survives is a brittle note in a steward's ledger. 2 found above in the tower, lying behind the arras, removed and cast into the snow by order. Removed. Cast into the snow. It sounds almost sterile, clinical, but make no mistake, it was a death sentence. That night, a blizzard swept across the moors. The wind howled like a beast through the stone arches. Snow piled against the gates, and the 2 servants, young men perhaps, or boys no older than 15, were dragged from the tower, down the stairs, through the courtyard, and hurled into the storm. Not lashed, not imprisoned, simply thrown out and left. By morning, they were found frozen beneath a drift, their skin pale as wax, hands clenched together, as if they had held each other in the final moments, as if their last thought had not been of punishment, but of warmth they almost reached. This wasn't an isolated event. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval castles, space was power. The upper floors belonged to those deemed worthy. Everyone else, servants, cooks, grooms, maids, were packed into damp cellars or stables. They were expected to endure, and if they didn't, if they dared to seek comfort not assigned to them, they were punished, brutally. Because space was more than geography. It was social order. The nobles lived above, the servants below. To cross that boundary, even for survival, was considered trespass, even treason. And so, these two were made examples, the guards who threw them out, likely servants themselves, following orders, afraid of joining them, the steward who signed the order, merely enforcing the rules, the lord of the castle, never mentioned. He would have been asleep in the same tower the boys had sought, wrapped in fur, warmed by fire. That is the cruelty of the system. The people who upheld it were victims too, but the ones at the bottom paid the highest price, all for trying to be warm. Today the tower still stands. Historians debate which castle it was. Some point to records from Cumbria, others say Yorkshire, but the stones remember. Somewhere beneath heavy snow, 2 graves remain unmarked. No crosses, no names, just a silence deeper than death. And every winter, when frost bites the hills and wind screams through empty corridors, it's easy to imagine them there, 2 shadows in the dark, pressed behind a curtain, whispering hope to each other, hoping that maybe just for one night, the world might forgive them for wanting to live. But it didn't. Because in 1290, warmth was not a right. It was a privilege, and to reach for it was to be cast into the cold.